going to welcome the school captain of Sydney Secondary College at Black Bottle Bay, James Neo, to acknowledge country. James.
Inner Sydney Voice acknowledges the traditional custodians of the lands across the areas they service, particularly the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, traditional custodians on the land on which their office is located. We pay respects to our elders, past and present. Inner Sydney Voice celebrates 50 years of community action. As a local regional social development organisation, they have a long history of speaking up. The Inner Sydney Voice has played a significant role in speaking with and speaking up for the local Aboriginal communities across Redfern and Waterloo. In many ways, the earlier community action has led to the development of independent Aboriginal organisations. It has also led to community awareness and shifts in attitudes and understanding. Today, Inner Sydney Voice is committed to working with Aboriginal community-controlled organisations and supporting their work in creating an equal say for a fairer world. Thank you.
So it's great to have Sydney Secondary College represented by such a fine young person, so thank you. Wonderful. You are all activists. That's why you're in this room. Would you label yourself as an activist? Yeah, Jeff's nodding. Yes, absolutely. I agree with you, Jeff. Yeah. Does anyone in this room think they're not an activist? Good. We've got, Ricky, let's not go there. Yeah.
I'm retired.
You're a retired activist. Yeah, once an activist.
Retired activist.
Yeah, once an activist or always an activist. 50 years. It's a 50-year celebration, and it's really lovely to see so many people in this room today. People who have had a real connection with Inner Sydney Voice or Inner Sydney Regional Council for Social Development. I don't want to acknowledge anyone in particular because I will forget other people, but throughout the next hour and a half, we will all acknowledge the role we've played to making this region a fairer region. And we will all no doubt say there's more to do. But I want to take you back to 1974. Billy Don't Be a Hero was the #1 hit at the time. Anybody remember who sang Billy Don't? Paper Lace, yeah. They also had another hit song. Does anyone remember that? The Night Chicago died, sorry, just letting you know. But lucky for us Aussie rockers like myself, it was also a really important year because Cold Chisel was formed, and they were set to change the stage, international stage of rock music. And that happened because there were activists who were really trying to promote and position Aussie rock on that international stage. You might know something else was really important in 1974. Gough Whitlam was the Prime Minister of Australia. And he and the Labor Party were introducing sweeping reforms. They abolished the White Australian policy and passed the Racial Discrimination Act, ushering in this brand new era for multiculturalism. A significant change where people like Joseph Ferreira and my friend Esther Chillis Pascalides have had a massive career since that white Australian policy was abolished. At the same time, they made the pill affordable and accessible by removing the tax on contraceptives. They implemented free higher education, and James, get this, Gough Whitlam implemented free higher education, which meant for the first time, first person in a family was able to go to university. Things have changed. They legislated no-fault divorce, so women could choose to leave an unhappy marriage without being financially burdened. They introduced Medicare to allow universal health care for all Australians. Now that was happening at a federal level. At a state level, Thomas Lewis was the Premier of New South Wales and he was leading the Liberal Party. I couldn't find much about his achievements. All I could find was that he spent his term trying to fight the introduction of Medicare. So I'm not wanting to be biased. However, what I also found is that in 1974, the Ernie Sigley Show, Matlock Police and Number 96 were the key front-running television programs in New South Wales, much to the outrage of parents and family groups saying that our children were really at risk. So there was this massive campaign to shut down those television stations because children were being brainwashed by television, social media. I'm not sure whether there's a connection, but we'll talk about it. 1974, prisoners riot and set fire to the Bathurst jail. And in December of that same year, on Christmas Day, all of us will remember the tragedy up in the Northern Territory when Cyclone Tracy hit, with 68 people dying, and according to the research, 48,000 people were left homeless. Significant. Closer to home, the Sydney coastline was lashed by 3 storms that caused enormous damage that really changed planning laws in our coastal line for generations to come. At the same time, something else really significant happened closer to home. A group of students, academics, seniors and housewives, does anyone remember, broke into a house in Glebe and set up a new refuge, that's right, Rebecca, called Elsie's. Yeah. It was the first women's refuge in 1974. It was an amazing time to be around. And, you know, people were rolling up their sleeves. Well, everyone will know that refuge movement that started in 1974 was so significant. Everything we have come to value, healthcare, public education, women's refuges, laws that protect people's rights, has happened because a group of citizens have cared enough to say, you know what, this ain't fair, we're getting together and doing something about it. At that time, around 74, there was a young guy, a young bloke, who has since become a known and respected international sociologist. And he got together, he was heading up a group called the Surrey Hills Residents Action Group, and he brought together 40 people to discuss the establishment of a regional council for the social development under the then Whitlam government. How cool was that? I am going to introduce this amazing panel of speakers. Professor Emeritus Professor Andrew, we were joking because no one could say his last name, and he said, say it as you like. Who can pronounce Andrew's last name? Jakubowicz. Yeah. Sorry? No,
Tom knows how to say it.
Emeritus Professor Andrew Jakubowicz. Sorry, Andrew. Andrew, you played such a significant role in the establishment of regional council and other agencies, and we are delighted to have you here. We're also delighted to have the amazing Janet Green. Janet heads up the Junction Neighbourhood Centre and has been in the sector for over 40 years. I know Janet, we say that, I've known Janet for a very long time, but people will know that she is an absolute change maker. Sitting on this panel too is a woman that I remember very fondly as a young social work student, working with another woman who was really scary called Margaret Barry. This other woman wasn't as scary, or so we thought, but her name was Faye Williams. She just was softer. So welcome to Faye, it's great to have you here. And may not know Mark Skelsey. Mark, thank you so much. Mark is a communication media specialist, and he's also an author. Views to Die For is about to be published, come out next year, so we're very excited. He's got an amazing bent on the history of development in Sydney, and has gone in deep and understood what happened leading up to the Juanita Nelson murder. Most people in this room will know about that. If you don't, you should really understand that really important history. So welcome. You are all in this room because you have played a significant role. Andrew, setting the scene, it's 1974. Thinking back that time in the 1970s, can you explain what it felt like to be amongst all that change? What were people angry about? What did they want to see change? And what enabled you to drive that change? Have you got a microphone? Yeah. Any microphone? Oh. Okay. Oh yeah, we do. too. Look, right
Yeah,
here.
right in front of
Oh,
you.
right.
I think it was a bit.
Sounds good.
Yeah, it's good.
Sounds
Is
good.
that on?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, it's a bit like that, isn't it? It sort of confronts you. It's immediately in front of you, and yet you don't see it. Well, I think that was a bit like 1974. Things were already rolling. It's really the end of the 60s that this stuff starts to happen. I was just mentioning to Mark, I think probably the global changes that took place in 1968, Paris, the rising opposition to the Vietnam War, the mobilisation of women in Australia, the first signs of the gay movement, the fact that the Indigenous people of Australia had suddenly been made citizens, 1967. All of these things were actually sort of dramatic changes in the historic structure of Australian society. And in the middle of it all, I think we should pay due respect to this, in the middle of it all, probably the most significant event, though it seems weird to say it now, was the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. And the reason for that was that it completely fragmented the left, the organised left in Australia at the time, and it led to the emergence really of three different strong left union-based groups, each with a very different philosophy. In fact, four, if I count our friends the Trotskyists, four approaches about how you dealt with the challenges of capitalism. And the biggest one for a lot of people was what was happening to Sydney. And roll back slide, I won't keep going on too long on this. One of the things that Gough Whitlam said was, when he comes to government, the sign of change will be sewered toilets in Western Sydney. And there was this very basic sense that the class structure of Australia had really immiserated millions of people. The political engagement of the government with the Americans in Vietnam had taken a generation of young Australian men and traumatised their families. And there was a sense that nothing was going to change unless people did it themselves. It simply wasn't going to change. And you could see it with your mate Tom Lewis, right? One of the best examples of concrete masquerading as a politician. He was...
Tell us what you really think.
Yeah, that's okay. I think the main thing about it was this sense that we were able to do stuff. Right? So there were demonstrations everywhere. My colleagues at New South Wales were confronting censorship. That was also a really big thing. Wendy Bacon and the crew at Tharunka were going into court saying some quite scurrilous things about various sky pilots that they were particularly impressed by. And all of those things have generated, I think, an amazing sense of mobility and anger is probably the wrong word, opportunity. And it was everywhere.
Sounds like a really exciting time. Anyone around at that time? Yeah. Can you remember? Yeah. Oh no, Michael, you would be way too young. Yeah. Absolutely. Janet, here we are. Janet Green has been in the sector, as I said, for 40 years. She's leading a community group called Junction Neighbourhood Centre, JNC. She's also just recently been appointed to the board of the LCSA. What does community action look like today? We just heard what it was like, what the environment was like. What does it look like
Can
today?
I just indulge you for a moment, because I'd like to share a story from some of those earlier days, because it's absolutely fabulous to be here and to be part of this celebration. It's a big year for 50th, we've just had ours too. But I just wanted to share, and Marika's kind of alluded to this already, my first contact.
Speak up, please. Right in the mic.
Sorry, is that better?
Yep.
Sorry. I just wanted to share my first contact with Inner Sydney Voice, which was in Inner Sydney Regional Council for Social Development, and in those days people spent a lot of time working out how to have a shorter name. But it was about 35 years ago, and I was a very young new manager in a service in Surrey Hills and working in the employment field. And I went to their office, Inner Sydney Voice's office in Waterloo, which is exactly the place that they work now, except very, very, very cluttered. With decades of archives. I went to a meeting on unemployment, and that was the first time I ever met Mark Barry. Now, I only can say one thing. For a young worker, she was terrifying, absolutely terrifying. She was so tenacious and such a strong activist, and I think that really sort of says a lot about the founding principles that sit within Inner Sydney Voice from those early days. But I am going to talk a little bit more about today because I think that's useful. And I'm going to make no apologies. I'm going to talk from the perspective of a small NGO working in the environment today, where things are quite different. I think it's fair to say that small organisations are under huge pressures, and in some parts of our work, I feel like we're actually under threat as service delivery just becomes completely marketised. And I've reflected over the years about what's changed over the years, and I think in what would be the early years or the formative decades for Inner Sydney Voice, activism was a lot more about rallies, protests, campaigns, and things like that. But I think today, in a lot of our work, if we actually want to influence change, we've got to be really quite strategic about it. We no longer deal with people working in funding bodies who are former community workers. They are contract managers. They're only interested in whether all your boxes have been ticked, and I think so that it's certainly no sense of community development there. And I think because of that, the policy makers in government are so far from the people you deal with day to day that it's much harder for small NGOs to influence policy. So I think just reflecting on, and I'm largely about our organisation at JNC, our community action for people working in the sector in a small organisation like ours. At one end of the spectrum, there's the work that we do to advocate for an individual person. It might be a woman who's experienced domestic violence and has nowhere to live. It could be someone living in public housing where their property is covered in mould and is almost shouldn't be lived in. So that's that. At one end, there's that individual advocacy to support individuals to navigate the service system, and I make no apology in saying there's a lot of it's about navigating their relationship with Homes New South Wales. And at the other end, it's much more about at the sort of bigger picture, and it's about trying to influence people, and that requires smart and strategic collaborations. I think there's some challenges for us. We need to have good data, and we need to have good stories, and it's interesting how some really simple story just influences people. We have one that we share, which is true, and it's happened for years and years. We will tell people, we have clients in our aged services where the only person they've seen in a fortnight was the support worker that they worked with, came to work with them for 2 hours. That's the level of social isolation people are experiencing. And so having those good stories is really important. But I think the other thing, and I think we've learned this a lot in the last few years, certainly in my time at JNC, is about looking for really good opportunities for collaboration and for forming good partnerships to influence decision makers. And I just wanted to share a couple of current examples which I think are really interesting. I see our friends from LCSA are in the room, and I think one of the really interesting ones is a current initiative by LCSA as part of a much bigger piece around core funding, is the formation in the New South Wales Parliament of the Parliamentary Friends of Neighbourhood Centres. Part of a big advocacy piece around core funding, but using that really strategic relationships with local members who understand the value of the work we do in local communities. A second example, and a few of my colleagues in this are in the room, is some work we're doing on social isolation for older people, and in that the coming together, the collecting of the evidence and the great work our researchers have done, and the collaboration around the future advocacy is really important. And there's also examples where it just doesn't happen, and I've got some terribly sad ones, so I won't share them. Talk to me later. So I think in terms of the challenges, the frustration,
Just hold off on the challenges. Okay? Just
Okay.
come back to you on the challenges,
Okay.
because I think we're going to chat about them. What I've noticed, and I don't know if anybody else has noticed, is there's been a real shift in language. We are so polite. We've become very polite, Janet. Andrew, you know, I know it was gutsy in the 70s, and I remember even the 80s when I first met Mark Barry and some of the local residents. I was young, but you know, I was scared because the language was very direct but very clear. It was unambiguous. I'm going to go to Mark. As I said earlier, Mark's a journo, he's a media specialist, communication specialist, he's worked with community groups. There's this thing about community groups or community organisations, the over-professionalisation of those groups, Mark. I think, what have you seen and what have you learned from frontline community groups? I know I've met you at one of our local neighbourhood groups. What have you learned about that kind of action?
So thank you, Marika. So yeah, I do have a background as a journalist. Also worked in the state bureaucracy and various senior communication positions, and I did move into the suburb of Dulwich Hill in 2008, and almost immediately became involved in various community actions. The first community action was to build something called an Inner West Greenway, which is a community-led project to build a 5-kilometre environmental cycling and walking track between the Cooks River and the Sydney Harbour. Huge amount of work over time, letter writing, rallies, a whole range of things. We even made, and I've got a show and tell. I'm going to horrify Marika with a show and tell to show that community activism needs to be fun. We even made our own bandicoot hat as well, which people really like. So there you go. You can wear it later, and I'll only charge $5. But that was one action, and the other action, I guess, we really worked on was in regard to development plans for our suburb. The planned conversion of the Bankstown line to the metro line has led to numerous plans for mass rezonings around my suburb since 2015, and we set up a local community group to really try to analyse that, and a particular concern about impacts on good planning, but also affordable housing, destruction of existing affordable housing and lack of new affordable housing. So I think some of the things I suppose I learned from that was, I actually think the yelling period's probably over a little bit. I'm misquoting you there a little bit, Marika, but let's just call it. I think social media has made it incredibly hard to do that, because the yelling just comes back even harder if you do yell. And I think therefore the advocacy that we've done has been very much about talking. It's been very much about evidence-based, using things like photo montages and photos. Imagery is incredibly important. I think it's more important these days about being tenacious and not giving up, and knowing that you're just simply not going to go away, to create an exhaustion in government. I think as well that if the community really does want something, it is almost certainly going to happen. I think there's still huge power in communities, but I think it possibly is a different form, and you do need to achieve consensus. If you don't have that consensus, you're actually just going to achieve division. So I think that's something that and you need evidence and research. So, but I do think, and maybe we're going to talk about it, I think some of the principles and the environment that came through the mid-70s are very much challenged at the moment, and I guess that's probably what I'm going to explore a little bit more in my book next year as well.
Thanks, Mark. And as we're talking, have a little think about how you've actually changed how you advocate and how you position issues that you're worried about. If you've been in the sector for a long time, if you've been a community activist for a long time, how have you changed? How has your language changed? Because I can tell you there's a woman, Faye Williams, who I used to work with, again, young woman, young social worker in the sector, and Faye at that stage was the HAC, Home and Community Care Development Officer, working in the Sydney Voice. And Faye, in the Sydney Regional Council for Social Development back then, Faye would sit back at a public meeting, let everybody else say something, and then note that no one was going to say anything that wasn't too polite, and then she'd get the microphone, and I knew the bureaucrats were going to listen. Faye, How important is it for paid workers to speak up?
Well, I think the language, as you said, is different now, and so I find a problem with some of the language, even with the question that I'm addressing, because I don't think we should be even considering pushing back. I think we should be standing on very strong and very proud on a platform of social justice. It's always been needed and it's still needed now. We need to be clear about what's needed and not go, oh, a government person might not like that and we might not get our funding. We cannot achieve anything or hang on to what we've got if we take that approach. The other thing I think we need to understand is that the jobs that we do, we know what they are. We know what makes them work. We know the needs of the people. The government doesn't know that. The bureaucrats don't know that. They can't provide those services. And they need us to provide them. So not only do we have to consider what they want, they have to consider how much they need us. We need people in nursing homes, they've suddenly realised. So there's lots of other services that need to be delivered. What about teachers? We can't get anyone to teach anymore. So the government needs us, and we should be strong and clear about how important our work is and what works, because we know what works, and we have to take every opportunity to tell the bureaucrats that's a great idea, but it's not going to work. And the one they really loved was, oh well, you tried that 10 years ago and it didn't work then. They really love it when you come out with that one. My son is an engineer and he builds bridges, and the government says we want a bridge and there's the money. They don't worry about not knowing what girders and what weighs and how long and the whole thing. They just get on and do it. And we should have the confidence in our ability to do the job and to know what's needed and to stand up for that. Is this the kind of thing you...
Don't mind us, Faye. But let me just say this, if I can just pause there, I'll come back to you. Here's the thing, that in this room there are activists, there are frontline people, there are people who have rolled their sleeves, dug in deep, have worked to position and advocate for social justice. And now they hold some of the most senior bureaucratic roles in our service system. Beck Pinkstone, welcome. I don't think anyone needs to tell Rebecca Pinkstone, CEO of Homes New South Wales, about social justice. I think she gets it. But she is now working within a government framework, and she has some rules that our community sector doesn't. But more importantly, I'm going to go to Andrew in a second. We talk about the professionalisation of advocacy in a sense. You know, we've got all these groups. In fact, you started Inner Sydney Voice, and you've grown over the years with people like Jeff Turnbull, got Vivian Pusey in the room, who was chairperson. This was a group of people getting together with piddly funding. I mean, of course, we're rolling in it now, aren't we? Leanne, who's also our treasurer,
We will be.
But it's certainly, back then, frontline people living the issues were actually driving the advocacy. How important is to facilitate those frontline groups, Jenna?
You know, I haven't finished.
I'm going to come back to you.
Oh, good. Well, she hasn't. She's telling me I will come back to you.
Thank you.
I will come back to you. Let's go to Andrew on that, then we'll come back.
While the others were talking, I was trying to remember what it was actually like setting up the Inner Sydney Regional Council. And that was really amazing. And because it was this bizarre situation, the real power behind it was the BLF and the trade unions. Right? Without them, zip, never would have happened. So that was the first thing. Secondly, there were two government departments, two Commonwealth government departments that were, they both had their fingers in the honey jar. The first of those was social service, social security, whatever it was then. They created the idea of the regional councils for social development, and they were quite bureaucratic models. They were sort of tripartite models of quadripartite, but the people somehow or other got involved. Local government, state government, federal government, right? So there were professional planners, there were public servants, there were politicians, and there were all these resident groups. Right, that was one model. And then running through the other side of it was Tom Uren's Department of Urban and Regional Development. Right. Now, all of these, if you like, bodies were colliding, sometimes colluding, sometimes collaborating, sometimes contesting what was going on in the place. And I remember the first time we really tried to get local government involved in the Inner Sydney Regional Council, and a bunch of us, sort of young idiots from recently graduated or wherever we were, activists, some trade unionists, turned up at Leichhardt Council. Now, at the time, Leichhardt Council was the bear pit in which Oraglass and Weiner, people may remember those names, two good old Trotskyists, Labor Party ex-councillors, could see that that something was happening. They knew how to play the right-wing Labor Party. They knew how to play the SPA and the traditional left-wing groups. But this bunch of post-68 quasi-revolutionaries, whatever we were, turning up and saying we want to collaborate for social well-being, and we want to change the way in which people think about their capacity to influence decisions about their lives. I mean, that's really the heart of it. And there was this wonderful moment, when you could see Oraglass, you could see the sort of the cogs working in Oraglass's brain as he was trying to work out, is this something that we should get on board with because we're so smart we can run it? Or is this something that we should cut off at the ankles because it's going to make life difficult? And I can remember that moment like it was smoky. Remember smoking? So it was smoky. And everyone was moving around trying to work out. Anyway, what came out of that, in fact, was something not unlike what was originally planned with the regional council model. There was the idea behind that. To be quick, the idea behind it was the states were too parochial and local government was too small. What Australia really needed was national government and regional councils. Get rid of the states, get rid of local government, and have a participatory-based democratic structure that responded to the differences in local areas, but could collaborate in the framework of a national plan which was about quality of life, income, environment, and a whole bunch of other things that were starting to emerge there. And when I met up with Marg when she used to work at Sydney University. She was in the Students' Rep Council at that time. And I remember meeting up with Marg in Waterloo, in the old terrace house she lived in, with her mum. And one of the things about meeting up with Marg, and some other people here may remember, Marg and her mum lived on Faye Webster, steak and kidney pudding. So there were always empty tins from Faye Webster, and we all smoked like chimneys. And I just have this image, like the iconic image of the movement, is people meeting around a kitchen table in a smoky room, cigarette stubs going into their Faye Webster can, and arguing like mad about what was going to happen next. So that's a fairly wide-ranging thing. But it did mean, in that situation, go back to your actual question, that there were young planners and social workers who had been through professional training, and then there were people who'd done the other people who were graduates from political science courses, or in some cases from chemistry courses, whatever, out there. And then there was a whole bunch of people whose main education had been life. And they were able to work together, which I found really exciting. I mean, I know I learned an enormous amount through that period. And the fact that we could create something that has life 50 years later is really scary, but really nice.
It's pretty amazing actually. We're just doing it over smashed avocados now and on toast and some lattes. I think that's the fundamental difference. I'm going to go back to you, Janet. Did you want to add anything to that? Because I cut you off before, and I'm going to come to Faye, because look at that, she's got the microphone, look at it, look at that.
Dueling microphones. I guess I just probably just like in the mouth. Sorry, I'm so bad at this. I think I want to just share some challenges for what it's like on the front line working in the sector today. And I have many. This has brought up back many memories for me. I was one of those people who was in the first year of free education at university. I think some of the challenges, it's really frustrating and it's really hard to get the small voices heard in what is a very cluttered space, and where the big players in community services and across the sector have whole teams of people doing government relations, and we're just small voices, and we don't, I don't think have as many of the challenges to really put some of the pressure on that perhaps was an opportunity in the past. But I think there is the opportunity, and I think many of us are trying to do it well, to be really collaborative. And we went through a phase probably 20 years ago where competitive tendering came in our sector, and everybody became enemies, competitive, and that was very challenging. But I think that tide has turned back a little bit, and people are now increasingly understanding the value of collaboration and looking for strategic collaborative opportunities, and finding partners where the values are really shared. And it's interesting, in this group in the room, that some of those people have gathered as part of tonight's process as well. So
I
that's
think
a very polite answer, Marie.
It is polite. You are polite. You are polite.
But I think it's,
yeah, we're going to go to someone who's not always polite, but I'm just going to go 1 second, Faye. There's this common theme around collaboration back then, back now. It's bringing together people, not necessarily like-minded, not necessarily having the same experience, but absolutely driven by the same values, which is about fairness. When someone sees something ain't fair, it's how do you pull together people to actually make it fair? Faye, I stopped you before, and I apologise.
That's okay, I'll try and get G'd up again.
Can you think of a time? Can I give you a prompt?
No, I've got what I want. I think the problem we've got is that we are not clear enough, we are too diffident, we are not sure enough of ourselves, and this has been put upon us over the last many years. And I still, as I tried to say in the beginning, go back to the basics, right? Understand that we are fighting a fight about power and resources, and that we have to understand our role and we have to stand on that platform. And whatever the mechanics that we use, we have to believe it ourselves. If we're diffident, it's not going to go anywhere. And the other thing I think I wanted to talk about, as well as being sure about our role with government, we need to be sure about who employs us. We're not employed by government. We're employed by our NGO, right? Our NGO has a list of objectives. How long is it since you've pulled out your organisation's objectives? Because you'll probably find things there like social justice and advocacy and all the things that we really want to do as we deliver a service. I came to Regional Council and Cheryl Kelly, who was the other worker there, said, "Oh, I hate that program." That's often the way Cheryl was. She said, because it's all about delivering services and not about community development and empowering people. And I thought, well, here goes a challenge. What I'll have to do is deliver these services in that context. And that's what I did for the rest of my social work life. So you can do it on your platform, and you can also do it on the ground as you go about your everyday life. But don't forget that this is what we're here for, to change and keep up the correct power balance. Use your NGO. Your NGO is your employer. When I went out to go to the big conferences and stand up and take on the room, I knew Mark Barry had my back. Right? I'd come back and say, this is what I did, and she said, good on you, you know. So NGOs themselves believe that you have that power. It's your organisation, owned by your members. You take on a contract with government. They do not own you. Right? You can take on the contract, or you cannot take on the contract. You might lose your funding. You might lose your job. There's always jobs in nursing homes these days. What I'm saying is, if you don't stick with that, then you've lost before you start.
Thanks, Faye.
And the last thing I want to say is, you have to challenge these massive assumptions that are behind the changes incrementally that the government are doing. Remember efficiency and effectiveness? How that got as well. Remember outputs and outcomes. How do we do that? Remember quality assurance. And of course, the doozy of them all, marketisation. Remember, we were told we cannot deliver services as well as the private sector because we're not driven by the profit motive. Well, how well did all that go, folks? Where are we now with all that? So why did we not challenge that? And so, I don't know what the latest one is.
We did.
What's the latest one?
No, I think we did challenge, and we continue to challenge. Yeah, no, it's individualised funding now that is.
Yeah.
It's very much based on.
So what I'm saying is we need to have that mindset of not just accepting why the latest change has come. There is very often assumptions behind it that can't stand up if you really have a look at them. So I'm just encouraging people, it's all right for me, I've been retired for 20 years, but I'm encouraging people to go back to the fundamentals and believe in themselves and the value of the work that they do and the fact that they have a voice and they should use it. How you do that is the next question.
Thank you, Faye. Mark had his hand up. And then I'm going to go to Andrew.
I guess I'm just probably going to answer this in terms of my background as a communications professional and a journalist that's reported on this space for many years. I think in my research as well, when I look back in the 70s and my interviews with people like Andrew and others, you had predominantly very young people, I've got to say, Andrew, very young, people who were mainly full-time university students, paid to be university students. You had a media environment which was lapping up everything these people had to say. It was a very, it was a bit more of a, I don't know what the word is, but a society where people made comments in the media, they were lapped up, and therefore, and you had the BLF as well, and therefore challenging developers evicting residents, challenging the lack of new affordable housing, challenging the destruction of affordable housing for highways, and challenging the massive changes to inner Sydney society which were happening in the 70s. And the developer lobby group at that time, from what I could see, was just used to getting what it wanted from government. It was completely unsophisticated in its approach and didn't know what to do in the face of this, and so the battle was won. Fast forward 50 years, it is completely different. Social media is now where the battleground happens for these things, and all the groups are so much more sophisticated with their ability to make arguments in social media, including developer lobby groups and every other lobby group as well. What's now missing is any form of media environment where people can actually get a voice. Local newspapers have largely died, and the voice of the people being evicted from private residential accommodation is largely not heard anymore. It's completely the opposite of what it used to be. Acknowledging that New South Wales government is really trying hard to deliver additional social housing, but I think the battle and the argument has virtually changed on its head in 50 years.
Andrew, it sounds like you're, thank you, Mark. Well said.
As Mark was talking, I was thinking, what's the most vivid symbol of what Mark's describing? And I think we would all agree it's Sirius. Sirius was built as a consequence of action by residents in the rocks, working with VLF and with some professional planners. I was involved in a little exercise called the People's Plan for the Rocks, which was a mix of people who were living in the rocks area, plus a bunch of social scientists, planners, architects, and so on. And we came up with this proposition because the rocks was going to be completely demolished and everybody in there moved out. That just didn't happen. And symbolically, I think Tom Urin had a role in this, but the people from the rocks themselves said, we want more housing here. And the thought was, let's do that by creating the ugliest possible building that we can imagine. Right? It wasn't quite that, but that was part of it. So the architect said, we want to build something that is economic to build, which is modular and can be adapted, and has the best bloody view in Sydney, and we want to make it social housing. Right? So those values are incredibly important. 50 years later, how dare people who are in social housing have a view like that, a location like that, a lifestyle like that? This should only go to people who can pay many, many millions of dollars for these apartments. Right? And I think what Mark is getting at is there that the dynamic, the whole way in which neoliberalism as a philosophy has infiltrated the minds of people, probably best expressed by someone like Donald Trump as a sort of exemplar of that whole approach to the world, that's really changed. But on the other hand, I was mentioning this to Mark, I'm still involved in community action. I live in Coogee, and we're having a major battle. We won last night at council over the design of our local public toilet. Now, that's also significant, right? That 50 years ago, we were looking at saving suburbs, building social housing, constructing innovative, forward-looking ways of living, and now we're fighting to protect the facade of a toilet block. I mean, I think I'm being a bit cynical about this, but ironic, it's probably better than cynical. But I think the dynamic is definitely there. But what we do have, and I think Mark maybe is underplaying this, is we do now have a culture in which the right, where people assume the right to participate in those decisions. When all this stuff was starting, nobody thought that this was an idea, right? Like actually convincing the state government at the time, well, not the one at the time, the one that came immediately afterwards, and Paul Lander, who was the key minister in that, convincing them that you should legislate for participation was such an innovation. Right? And that paralleled what was happening with stuff like in a city council, regional council, and it paralleled the growth of resident action groups and all of this sort of stuff. So I think that the effect of that has been to change the way in which the landscape looks, the terrain looks, but the philosophies have also changed. But also, as I think Mark's saying, the people who want to get on with doing whatever they want to do and developing the place into nothingness, they've learned as well, and they are far more sophisticated, far more efficient. They have people who have been trained in community development programs in universities, and then get sent out to make sure that their employers get exactly what they want, not what the people want. So it is a much more complicated landscape, but one I think that's still has some advances.
I'm going to pause because I'm so worried that we're going to run out of time, because we could absolutely listen to these amazing people all day and talk this stuff, and we will over a drink. We will absolutely do that over a drink. Thank you sincerely to you for giving up your time this afternoon and having the conversations before. There's a couple of key themes that have come out of that. Number one, I have heard, is this whole issue of the values that underpin our action. Basically, social justice, thank you, Faye, is really what drives us. Number two, I heard, is of course we still need, there is a huge demand to make things fairer. And number three is that working together, paid people, community activists, people with lived experience, whatever way you want to book it up, that is the future, all wrapped up in a new digital world that is really about mobilising people for good. Thank you very much for speaking to us today. That was fantastic. We will before we go to Mark Barry Memorial Lecture, that'll be the amazing Julie Bates, who I'll introduce in a minute. I want to show you this amazing video.
We really wanted a house of our own. We looked around quite a lot and finally settled on this. Cost sort of every bit of available cash that we had. We'd been in units prior to that, and we had all the fights from next door heard through the walls and the plumbing up